By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt became President of the United States, the country was not in a good place. The Great Depression had left most of the country struggling to make ends meet and stay alive. Tensions in Europe led to increased discrimination against certain immigrant populations here, and there were still strict gender roles and dominating heterosexuality. But then, the Empire of Japan attacked the U.S. naval base Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the U.S. entered World War II. This video addresses the changes that FDR made to get the country out of the Depression, his reaction to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the ways that World War II changed things for minorities, at least until the war ended. Between 1933 and 1938, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt enacted a number of programs aimed at getting the U.S. out of the Great Depression. These programs are known as the New Deal. Importantly, some of the first of these programs addressed the financial problems that were part of what led to the Depression in the first place, including establishing the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which still protects investors and makes sure the markets are fair, orderly, and efficient, so the stock market doesn't crash like it did in 1929. Another New Deal program still going today is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which established an electric power utility that today provides power to all of Tennessee and parts of Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. Initially, it also helped develop the economy of the Tennessee Valley, which was hit hard by the Depression. Other legislation that still impacts us today includes the National Labor Relations Act, which guarantees employees the rights to organize unions, the Social Security Act, which created Social Security pensions for those above a specific age, and Social Security disability insurance for those who qualify, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which prohibits child labor, established the 40-hour work week, overtime pay, and a national minimum wage. As you can see here on the Wikipedia page for the New Deal, there were a number of programs enacted. I've included a link to the page below this video. But probably the best known part of the New Deal is the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. The WPA is known for employing people who were unemployed during the Depression, helping the economy recover. But more important was what they worked on. People working for the WPA worked on building up parks, schools, and roads across the nation, improving the nation's infrastructure. The WPA also supported the arts through Federal Project No. 1 and its 5 parts: the Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Writers Project, and the Historical Records Survey. Federal Project No. 1 supported artists and made their works accessible to the public, making some of these works accessible to people for the first time. One of the most important things to take away from all this was that the WPA supported U.S. citizens of all genders and races. The WPA and the federal government was more interested in helping the U.S. recover from the Great Depression and improving the country than in being exclusionary and focusing only on whites. The impact of the WPA and the New Deal can still be seen in many, many places across the country today. Until recently, the fact that the U.S. had put citizens and legal immigrants into internment camps, partially because of where they or their parents came from, was rarely talked about. Personally, I was in college doing research about the Nazis' concentration camps and death camps when I stumbled across an article about the internment of Japanese citizens during World War II. These are important parts of U.S. history that need to be discussed and understood. While people, including scholars, will try to say that internment camps are different from concentration camps, I, and others, disagree. Often the differences people point out apply to the death camps the Nazis established, not the concentration camps. There are people who were in internment camps that will call them concentration camps even today. In this video and in this course, I use internment camps because that is how I was introduced to the concept here in the US, and I still associate concentration camps with Nazi Germany. Ultimately, the difference between the two is the word and little else. Death camp, extermination camp, or killing center is a different thing. The extermination camps were established with the sole intent of murdering hundreds of people at a time, ultimately killing over 2.7 million people. While there were a number of concentration camps set up across Nazi-occupied Europe, there were only 6 extermination camps, most within Poland: Klemno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. While people were killed at concentration camps, that was not the goal of those camps. Trains would arrive at the extermination camps, unload those who had survived the trip, and within hours, those brought there would be dead and begin to be cremated. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, A concentration camp is a place where large numbers of people, such as prisoners of war, political prisoners, refugees, or the members of an ethnic or religious minority, are detained or confined under armed guard, used especially in reference to camps created by Nazis in World War II for the internment and persecution of Jews and other prisoners. And their definition of intern is to confine or impound someone, especially during a war. I don't see a difference between an internment camp and a concentration camp aside from the word. While many Nazi concentration camps weren't concerned about keeping their prisoners alive, that's not necessarily a part of a concentration or internment camp, which differentiates it from the death camps. This is a very important aspect to remember. As you are aware of by now, the Japanese internment camps during World War II are the most discussed instance of these camps in history. But what isn't often discussed is how other groups have also been detained in camps, especially during times of war. In 1917, 2 sets of regulations were issued by President Wilson restricting Germans living in the US, including those born here. Following those restrictions, around 2,000 ended up in 2 internment camps. But most of these individuals were cited for some behavior, not simply detained because of their heritage. And this happened again during World War II. By the time the US entered the war, German and Italian Americans were already under some suspicion. It doesn't help that there were supporters of the Nazi Party here in the US, even holding a rally in Madison Square Garden in the late 30s. Enemy aliens, aka those of German, Italian, and Japanese heritage, were required to register with the government and carry, quote, enemy alien registration cards, end quote, to identify themselves. Although Italian Americans didn't receive quite the same level of scrutiny that German and Japanese Americans did. By late 1942, many of the restrictions against Italian Americans were lifted, while the restrictions against German and Japanese Americans were firmly in place. Soon after Pearl Harbor, over 1,000 German nationals who were under surveillance were arrested. Over the course of the war, over 11,500 German Americans were interned. In addition to that, the U.S., quote, orchestrated and financed the removal of 4,058 Germans, end quote, and 288 Italians who were living in Latin American countries, placing them in camps in Texas, Florida, Oklahoma, North Dakota, and Tennessee. But, as you read, all of this paled in comparison to what Japanese Americans experienced during the war. Anti-Asian sentiment, as we have discussed previously, had carried over from the 1800s. Even Germany feared an Asian invasion in the late 1800s, with Kaiser Wilhelm II coining the phrase Yellow Peril in 1895. By the beginning of World War II, anti-Asian xenophobia had spread across the Americas, influenced by the xenophobia in the US. Issei, Japanese immigrants, and Nisei, their children born in the US and other American countries, found their rights slowly being eroded, leaving them almost without a nation despite being legally in the country they were living in and showing loyalty to that country, including the US. There was a 1941 report that said more than 90% of Nisei and 75% of Issei were, quote, completely loyal to the United States, end quote. This and other reports said that there was no reason to question their loyalty, but obviously those reports weren't considered. Erica Lee writes in her book, America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States, that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, quote, the Hood River police chief warned Japanese American residents to, quote, stay home, use the English language if possible, and do not congregate in one place, end quote. These warnings, although well-intentioned, only affirmed the fact that Japanese Americans were considered enemies of the United States by virtue of their ancestry, end quote. This was likely far from the only place this was happening. Within the first 48 hours after the attack, 1,291 Japanese, 367 in the territory of Hawaii, and 924 in the US, were arrested by the FBI as, quote, dangerous enemy aliens, end quote, with no evidence indicating they were a danger. By mid-December 1941, there were proposals to remove and incarcerate Japanese immigrants and their descendants. On February 9, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the government the ability to round up and remove anyone deemed a threat to the U.S. without any proof that they were a danger. It did not specifically target the Japanese, but that's who the order was used against. Japanese Issei and Nisei across the Americas, especially along the Pacific coast, not only were removed from their homes and incarcerated, but had their assets frozen and their homes and businesses sold off. While Japanese Americans in the U.S. were rounded up as a whole within the exclusion zone along the West Coast, Japanese living in Hawaii were not. Hawaii was under martial law with General Delos Emmons as military governor. Emmons didn't see a reason to remove all the Japanese from the islands. They made up 90% of the workforce in transportation, agriculture, carpentry, and other vital industries. Only 1,444 Japanese, a combination of immigrants and citizens, were incarcerated on the mainland. The rest remained in Hawaii under severe restrictions until the end of the war. At first, the removed were taken to assembly centers, which were often hastily put together and included places like horse racing tracks, where people lived in either hastily constructed temporary shelters or in buildings not meant for habitation on straw mattresses with few utilities and little privacy. Eventually, they were shipped off to one of 10 internment camps across the U.S. west of the Mississippi. 2 camps were located in California, with the furthest 2 camps located in Arkansas. Families were kept together unless a family member, usually a father or older son, were deemed to be dangerous and in need of isolation. These camps were built specifically to house the families, giving them basic housing that included stoves for cooking and warmth, running cold water, and basic furniture. The camps also had a dining hall to better feed the inmates and give them a community space, schools to teach the children, medical facilities, including surgeons, and guard towers around the camp to keep an eye on the barbed wire fences to make sure no one was trying to escape. The inmates celebrated holidays, both US and Japanese, while they lived there. Some had brought tools with them, like sewing machines, and would work together to try and improve their living situations with whatever they could. By early 1943, a loyalty questionnaire was given to all Japanese Americans over the age of 17. Among other questions, it asked all males old enough for the draft, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?" It also asked everyone else if they would be willing to, quote, "swear unqualified allegiance or obedience to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attacks by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign-born power or organization?" US-born Nisei rarely hesitated to answer yes to both questions. But for some Issei especially, answering yes to the second was hard. They worried that they would become stateless if they said yes and face further barriers if they said no. Most ended up saying yes to both, and, quote, over 1,200 men volunteered for the U.S. Army. The U.S. government began to issue draft notices to Japanese Americans in the camps in January 1944. The 10 to 15% who answered no to the 2 questions were officially classified as disloyal and transferred to the newly segregated camp at Tule Lake, end quote. Japanese Latin Americans were sent to 6 enemy alien camps along the southern border. But, unlike Japanese Americans, these internees were not legally brought to the U.S., despite the U.S. government bringing them there. When the war ended, all of the camps were shut down, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling that, quote, the government had no authority to incarcerate loyal citizens, end quote. By March 1946, all of the camps had been closed, and the former internees were encouraged to resettle in the Midwest and on the East Coast because there was still anti-Japanese sentiment along the West Coast. But for those brought to the U.S. from Latin American countries, that wasn't an option since they were officially illegal aliens. Some were able to return to their home countries, but the majority were from Peru, and Peru refused to allow them to return. Some moved to Japan, taking children who had been born in Peru with them. Some stayed in the U.S., fighting for the right to stay in the country legally. In 1954, half of them were given entry visas thanks to an amendment of the Refugee Act of 1953. No matter where they were from, the Japanese population in the Americas was forever changed due to the action of the U.S. government during their participation in World War II. In 1988, the U.S. government apologized for interning Japanese Americans and gave each survivor $20,000 in reparations. Not each family, each survivor. While it cannot change what they went through, it was an acknowledgement that the internment was wrong, which is more than some groups have received. In 2001, 10 detention sites were preserved as historical landmarks, preserving this dark time in U.S. history for future generations to learn from. I highly recommend reading They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. It tells the story of him and his family leading up to and during internment during the war in graphic novel form. World War II was a time when many oppressed and marginalized groups found themselves in positions they could not have occupied previously. Men of all races, classes, and ethnicities were part of the armed forces, working with their white countrymen to fight the Axis powers. Women also found themselves in new places, working in factories, playing baseball, teaching, and doing a long list of jobs that men had been doing but couldn't because they were overseas. These opportunities gave marginalized populations hope that things would become more equal after the war ended. When World War II began, even before the US officially entered the war, people of all races and genders enlisted in the military. Asians were not generally allowed to serve, but Blacks, Indigenous, and Latino people were allowed to enlist, even if they were limited in what they could do once they had done so. But some of those populations ended up having big impacts and helped the Allies win the war. One group you might have heard of is the Code Talkers. Often they are referred to as the Navajo Code Talkers, but the Navajo Nation wasn't the only one involved. During World War I, members of the Choctaw, Cheyenne, Cherokee, Comanche, Ho-Chunk, Osage, and Yankton Sioux tribes were used to send messages in battle in their native languages. While the government and armed forces missed it, the Code Talkers did not miss the irony of the US government, who had spent decades oppressing and trying to eradicate their languages, suddenly asking them to now use them to help the US. This wasn't something planned in advance, but implemented using existing Indigenous members of the armed forces to help the US and its allies win the war. When World War II began, Indigenous men did not hesitate to enlist in the armed forces. Despite the oppression and discrimination they faced, especially at the hands of the US government, they did not hesitate to help defend the country they were living in. Remembering the Code Talkers of World War I, the Army, followed by the Marines and the Navy, began recruiting men to be trained as Code Talkers starting in 1940. In 1942, the first class of Marine Navajo Code Talkers had completed its training. The Code Talkers were given basic training, as well as training in developing and memorizing a military code for use in battle. The first code, Type 1 code, used Navajo words to represent English letters. Type 2 code eventually used 411 terms in Navajo that translated English words. Other tribes created similar codes using their language instead. Their work allowed for unbreakable coded communication among the troops, keeping Axis troops from understanding the communications. Their work was classified until 1968. In 1982, President Reagan honored the Code Talkers. In 2000, President Clinton signed a law awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the original Navajo Code Talkers, with President Bush presenting the medals in 2001 to the surviving Code Talkers and the families of those who had died before then. The Tuskegee Airmen were a primarily black group of fighter and bomber pilots who formed the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Medium Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces, now known as the U.S. Air Force. They were the first African-American military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces. Segregation in the armed forces meant that they were separated from their white colleagues and still faced discrimination from both the military and civilians. After having to fight to prove themselves worthy of flying in combat zones, 355 of the 992 trained were sent overseas. 68 were killed in action, and 32 were prisoners of war. Yet, like other black servicemen, when they were able to go off the bases in Europe, they faced much less discrimination than they faced at home, giving them a new sense of worth as people. They were able to protect bombers better than other groups, losing only a total of 27 bombers compared to an average of 46 from others, and soon became welcomed by white groups. After the war and segregation in the military ended, the Tuskegee Airmen were in high demand in the Air Force and in civilian flight schools as instructors. By 1949, it was mandated that they be reassigned to other units, which were previously all white, according to their qualifications. The story of the airmen has been told in a number of times in various films, television series, and books. One branch of the Army was the Women's Army Corps, allowing women to serve in the Army. It existed until October 20th, 1978, when it was disbanded and those serving were integrated with male units. In order to serve in the WAC, women still had to meet certain physical and mental standards. Once they were enlisted, they wore uniforms that included both pants and skirts, depending on the job they were doing. There was criticism of the WAC and those who served, seeing them as not feminine, despite generally appearing as feminine while in uniform. They weren't required to cut their hair, simply have it up in hairdos that kept their hair out of their face and off their necks. Black women were allowed to serve as WACs as well as white women. But, like men, they could not necessarily serve in any position. But they were trained alongside their white colleagues. By November 1943, Nisei women were also allowed to join, with 142 volunteering and serving alongside women of other ethnicities. One notable WAC battalion was an all-black battalion, the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion. Nicknamed the 6888, these women were recruited with the support of Eleanor Roosevelt to handle a backlog of over 17 million pieces of mail overseas. Those recruited went through basic training, and some transferred in from other locations in the WAC. Over time, the 6888 created a system to wade through the backlog of mail. Part of the problem was the mail was coming from men on the front lines. Mail was bloody, rained on, and muddy, obscuring addresses and names. They worked to figure out ways of finding names, deciphering serial numbers and logos of various units soldiers would include on the mail to figure out where they needed to be sent. They were given 6 months to get through the 17 million pieces of mail. They did it in 3, facing sexism and racism from the beginning. After VE Day in 1945, they were taken to France to deal with another backlog of mail, including pieces over 3 years old. They took care of that in 4 months. Despite all of this amazing work, reconnecting soldiers and families, sometimes from beyond the grave, their work was not publicly recognized until after the war. It wasn't until 2009 that they were first publicly recognized. As of July 2024, 2 members were still living. A documentary titled The 6888, No Mail, Low Morale was released. In December 2024, the Netflix film The 6888 debuted. I've watched the Netflix film, and it's a really good film that highlights a previously little-known and acknowledged part of World War II and U.S. history. When Japanese Americans were allowed to enlist after completing their loyalty questionnaire in 1943, around 33,000 served in the military, 20,000 of whom were in the Army. One of the most notable examples of their service is the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Infantry Regiment, which became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. The battalion was made up of Nisei, who were originally part of the Hawaii National Guard. Their success led to the creation of the 442nd, which was mostly Japanese-American Nisei, engaging in battles in Europe, earning them the nickname of the Purple Heart Battalion. Part of the 442nd liberated prisoners at one of the Nazis' slave labor camps. During World War II, discrimination against gays and lesbians increased because the military also made it illegal to be homosexual. If there was enough evidence of even one act that was homosexual, you could be discharged or be court-martialed. At the time, the military provided many queer people the opportunity to find others like them, but they had to be quiet about their relationships. This was the case through the 1990s until Don't Ask, Don't Tell was implemented to prevent attempts to get service members to out themselves. Only recently has it become legal for people to serve and be open about who they are, including transgender people. But even that is being challenged again. During the 2 world wars, more was expected of women because so many men were overseas fighting on the front lines, especially during World War II. People of all genders, races, and sexualities who were allowed to stepped up to fill roles left vacant when soldiers were called to serve in the armed forces both here and overseas. Factories of all kinds needed people to work in them, so people who could do the job were hired no matter their race or gender. Men who were ineligible to enlist, as well as women of all backgrounds, learned new skills as welders, riveters, and other aspects of physical labor and trades to assist the war effort in building transportation and weapons. At home, people grew victory gardens again, as they did during World War I, allowing more industrially grown food to go to the armed forces. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was founded in 1943 by Philip K. Wrigley of Wrigley Gum to keep baseball alive during the war while many players were serving in the armed forces. In 1948, the league reached a peak of over 900,000 spectators. The league ended in 1954, but was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1988. The 1992 film A League of Their Own is a fictionalized account of the establishment of the league, but features 65 original members during the recreation of their induction into the Hall of Fame. When the war ended, men returned and everything went back to its racist, sexist, genderist norm from before the war. That included women returning to their roles as wives and mothers. But because of the technological advances made during wartime, they found themselves with less work to do at home. Improvements in household appliances and food production meant wives and mothers had less work to do and nothing else to fill the time with. And people of color who served in the armed forces and experienced less discrimination overseas came back with a renewed sense of humanity and personhood and did not want to give that up. Queer people have been around for millennia. How they are defined and the words used to describe them have changed over time and depends on the culture. Here in the US, by the 20th century, it was common for queer people to live openly in private among trusted friends and family and work to pass as straight and cisgender in public. And many were fine with this arrangement. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, genderqueer, asexual, and other identities had created safe spaces where they could be fully themselves in private and worked out ways to be able to hide what they needed to in order to live peacefully in the rest of the world. For some, passing as cisgender or heterosexual meant they were hiding their biological sex and were able to fully be themselves without anyone knowing otherwise. For others, that meant putting on a performance that was read as conforming to societal norms. After World War II, the homophile movement began. There were pro-gay and pro-lesbian groups in the US before then, but it was during the late 40s and early 50s that vocal groups began to form and actively advocate for the rights of gays and lesbians, respectively. Part of what the homophile movement was fighting against were the laws that made homosexuality illegal. If you were caught being intimate with someone of the same sex or wearing clothes of the opposite sex, you were arrested. But the homophile movement was rarely queer. At this point in time, it was mostly gays doing their work, lesbians doing theirs, working together only when they felt it would benefit both groups. There was no LGBT community at that point. Femme gays and butch lesbians were fine, but being trans wasn't necessarily accepted. Bisexuality was not thought of as an identity on its own yet, as many used the term as part of the coming out process or were trying to figure out what their sexual preference was. Honestly, the visibility and validity of trans, non-binary, and bi/pansexual identities is relatively new, as are many of the other identities in the QIA+ part of the LGBTQIA+ community. Despite this lack of visibility, there were sex reassignment surgeries happening around the world. In 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld opened the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, Institute for Sexual Science, in Berlin, Germany. The institute led in research and treatment for people whose gender and sexuality fell outside of the normal. They provided support for LGBTQIA+ people, giving them a safe space as well as medical support. Hirschfeld coined the terms transvestite and transsexual to revert to people we now call transgender. The institute also performed gender-affirming surgeries for transgender patients, supported by therapy, to allow them to live their lives as their true selves. The institute was an early target of the Nazi regime and was destroyed in 1933. Other places around Europe were also established, which is how Christine Jorgensen learned about the surgeries. After serving in the Army in World War II, Jorgensen learned about sex reassignment surgery in Europe and in 1952 began the process of medically transitioning. When she returned to the US, she became a celebrity, openly transgender and advocating for transgender people. She made a career out of public speaking and acting. She is an exception to the dominant thinking at the time, discriminating heavily against transgender men and women who could either not pass or were openly transgender. Most faced arrest, imprisonment, and poverty if they lived openly. Homophile groups found themselves with plenty to be vocal against, partially because of the attention Senator McCarthy and McCarthyism received. As the textbook discusses in Chapter 2, McCarthyism is a term used to refer to the extreme anti-communist movement after World War II that was led by Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. McCarthy started searching for members of the Communist Party in the US and the US government starting in 1950 and going through the end of the decade. McCarthy headed numerous investigations that falsely accused a long list of people of being communist, destroying their careers and sometimes their lives. This included a number of people who worked in the film industry. But reports of his work were limited to newspapers and film reels because those were the options at the time. But soon, his search for those deemed un-American extended to gays and lesbians employed by the federal government, including the military. The Army-McCarthy hearings, unlike his anti-communist hearings, were broadcast across the nation on the new technology of television. The hearings were broadcast live on ABC from April 22nd through June 17th, 1954. The hearings ended up fueling what has been called the Lavender Scare, a play on the term Red Scare. They brought the threat of homosexuality into people's homes, making them more aware of their existence and spreading prejudice against queer people. The live coverage of the hearings brought the concept of homosexuality to many people and were the first time homosexuality and homosexual were mentioned on television. That's because of the establishment of the Hays Code by the Motion Picture Association of America, which restricted what could be shown in film and later on television. That included homosexuality being portrayed in what could be seen as a positive light in any way. Only way that homosexuals could be portrayed in film and television is if they were evil and punished. This has created the trope of the homosexual villain that lives on today. Disney makes use of this trope very frequently in its animated films, intentionally or not. But at the time, the idea of queerness being wrong was reinforced by the code and throughout much of popular culture.